these are things you should know as a property investor. This is where I talk about being a generalist rather than a specialist. At least knowing, having these strategies up your sleeve, you can call on them, you can utilize them, you can bring them back in Property Club, or email one of the mentors, whatever, when the time comes. And this could be what actually makes a deal work, whereas it didn't work before. So let's talk about I say no money down. What I mean is no to low money down, where you don't have to come in with hundreds of thousands of dollars necessarily, like you would purchasing traditional. This is the most important thing you need to think about. In fact, if I stop sharing for a second, can I just get an idea who in here, raise your hands if you own property. If you own real estate, put your hand up. Who owns land here? Cool. So every single one of you is lying, because not a single one of you owns real estate. Why? Why? Who actually owns the property?
The bank.
We got people coming through saying the bank, which is completely incorrect. The bank does not own the property. The bank controls your property through a document that they call a mortgage. So who actually owns property? Peter? Yep. Who? Who owns your property?
Well, I own it, at least my own house.
No, you don't. Okay, so you might own the building, but you don't own the land. Who owns the land?
Well, well, it depends. I mean, these are green title land. I should own it.
You said, what did you say?
Well, I'm calling it from.
No, you said a very key word there. Everyone in the chat now has
green title is
title.
Yeah.
Title.
Yeah.
Very good point. So everyone in the comments now has it. The government, the Crown. It's ultimately the Crown. I can't speak for Australia, New Zealand. It's the Crown. I'm not going to get into multi-titles. So that's complicated. But yes, the Crown owns all the land. You own a title which gives you the right? It gives you the control of land. So the minute you understand that nobody actually owns property anyway, because the government owns it all, now all we're doing is having conversations around what type of control do you have over it? Do you have control over the land as a freehold title, as a leasehold title? Do you have control over the land like a bank does in the form of a mortgage? Or do you have control over the title in one of these different 11 strategies that I'm going to be sharing with you today? But that is probably the key thing when we are talking little to no money down, is it's not about ownership. It's about control. How are you controlling property? So here are a few of the 11 strategies that we're going to go through, which allow you to get into property with little to no money down, from options to lease options, installment contracts and vendor carryback, with long settlements and early access, rent to rent, holiday accommodation, assignments, back-to-back, guarantees, and ultimately mezzanine finance. So this is a part you're probably going to want to take lots of notes, because I'm going to be going for a solid 40 minutes. I'm going to, as I said, this is all about you being a generalist. So knowing that it's a strategy that you can utilize anytime you need to. You don't actually need to know the ins and outs right now. All you need to know is that somebody out there knows the ins and outs. A lot of them are going to be your lawyer. They know all of these strategies. They've got the documents for all these strategies, including the option. So an option is literally the option, but not the obligation in order to purchase a property at a specified time for a specified price. and I would typically pay an option fee for that right. So let's say I want to buy Tim's property. It's worth 500,000 today. I think the property is going to go up in value, or I want to do a development. Well, what I can do is instead of committing to buying it, I can do an option. So it's worth 500,000 today, and I say to Tim, you know what? I'm going to buy it off you in 2 years' time for 550,000, but I'm going to pay you $10,000 in an option fee for the right to have that option. Now, in 2 years' time, when the option date comes up, I am not obligated to purchase it. I have the option, but not the obligation. If the exact opposite has happened, instead of being worth 550,000, it's worth 450,000, just walk away. Or if I'm doing a development and I don't want to have to put in a sale and purchase agreement with 27 million different clauses, etc., then what I can do is I can put the option on the property, 2-year option. It allows me to come in and do all my due diligence to get to potentially apply for resource consent, to do any geotech that I might need. I can even do pre-sales, all those sorts of things. And once I've been through all that, then it allows me to exercise my option and purchase the property, or if it doesn't stack up, I can just not go ahead with the option and walk away. That is an option. But if you add a lease component to it, now what you've got is a lease option. Many of you will know this better as a rent to buy, which is very similar. So you've still got the option in order to purchase a property for a specified price at a specified date. You'll still pay an option fee. However, this time you're going to take possession of the property, not ownership, but possession of the property through the form of a lease. You'll then negotiate what that lease looks like, whether it's weekly or monthly payments, and what exactly is included or covered in that lease. Now, this is going to work one of two ways. You can do a lease option as the purchaser, or you can do a lease option as a vendor. Now, given today I'm talking all about how you can buy property with little to no money down, I'm going to be sharing with you how you would do that as the purchaser. But tomorrow, I will be sharing with you how you can do that as the vendor instead. So because on this side, you as the purchaser, you are the one who paid for your property investment education, you are a professional investor, you are going to make this work the best possible way you can for you. Now, one of the best ways that I know that you can do this is when people are facing mortgagee sale. When a property gets to mortgagee sale, there's essentially two parties now who are interested in that property. The first is the bank, and the second is the vendor, the registered owner of that title, right? Now, the bank has exercised their right to sell the property under mortgagee sale and recoup their money. However, the owner can, at any point, they can still repay out or catch up or whatever they need to do to bring the mortgage back to good. So what if you've got someone, if you know someone, if you find a potential vendor who is going to mortgagee sale, you can almost just completely take over their property. And we've got one lady within the community, Wendy Wirtz, who's done this incredibly well in Christchurch. In fact, we're going to be running an event in March, live in person in Christchurch with her, just to showcase a lot of these different ways of how you can do that. But essentially, what you do is you agree to purchase a property in, for example, you put an option to purchase a property in 5 years' time, and you take over all their mortgage payments. So the lease would be in the form of whatever their actual mortgage payments are, and then they can just walk away with it without having to go to mortgagee sale and without it having hurt their credit. Because if they get bankrupted, if they get mortgageed, it can take up to most of us would be aware it can take up to 7 years to be able to get good credit again. But what they don't tell you is that that bankruptcy process can take up to 5 to 10 years anyway. I had a friend's dad bankrupted in the GFC 08, 09, and it seriously took over 12 years in order for him to be able to go through the bankruptcy side and then get through the entire 7 years to the point where he had good credit again. Absolutely insane. So by utilizing a lease option where you can take over their mortgage, pay their mortgage for them, they are still the registered proprietor on the title. However, you have a lease option in place allowing you to control that property. You can then do whatever you want, whether it's simply renting it out, whether again it's going through any resource consent to develop in the future, whether it's you hold it for the longer term. The other thing is, within any of that time frame, you can exercise your option to purchase at any point within that time frame. So if, for example, after 2 years, like we saw in COVID, when things just suddenly skyrocketed and it went from being worth like 500,000 to 750,000, you could exercise your right, purchase that property, sell it instantly, and pocket $250,000. And the only money you would have put down is whatever that option fee was, which, because you are a professional investor, you would negotiate to be as low as possible. It could be as little as $1, or it could be I'm going to pay your mortgage up to whatever date we're at right now. I did a lease option in the Netherlands, of all places. I've still got the documentation. There's no point sharing it because it's all in Dutch, but it was a Kiwi guy who had been living over there, training the Dutch sailing team for the Olympics. He was dating an English girl. He moved back to New Zealand for work. They ended up breaking up. She moved out, and he couldn't rent out the property. And I walked in and I was like, well, no wonder why. It's still filled with all your shit. And it looked like a unicorn walked into this room and like vomited everywhere. It's just colors and random stuff everywhere. So I did a lease option where I didn't even pay him I might have paid him €1. I then paid him a monthly lease. I then arbitraged, meaning I painted the unit up, got rid of all those stupid colors, and then I put another renter in, and I made that margin between what I was paying him and what my tenants were paying me from subletting from me. And that added instant cash flow to me and helped cover my travels as I was traveling around the world. It ended up being a major pain in the ass, to be honest. So I was like, you know what? I actually don't want this anymore. I cancelled. He was more than happy because I'd fixed it up. I'd put tenants in, and then he was just able to continue receiving the rent from the tenants. And he had to do a bit of work around the boiler, heater, central heating the unit, that sort of thing. But that's essentially how a lease option works. Very little risk from your side, but the potential is very high on the other end. Now, if a lease option is considered a rent to buy, then an installment contract is a hire purchase. This is where you are obligated. So just as in a hire purchase, you have purchased the actual goods, you're just paying it off over time, that is very similar to what an installment contract is as well. So what it does is it gives you basically early occupancy. Again, we're now talking possession, but not ownership yet, of the property with an extended settlement. So for example, it could be, if we come back to, let's say I'm buying Tim's property again, 500,000. Let's say, for example, and this is a situation we're seeing a lot right now. Someone who has purchased, maybe they purchased off the plan, or they purchased a property, it's gone down in value. They can't sell it today without taking a loss, but they're also bleeding, right? Because it's now negatively geared, interest rates have gone up, interest deductibility, all that sort of stuff. I could say to Tim, look, you purchased your property for 550, it's now worth 500. What I'll do is I'll buy it off you for 550, but I'm going to take immediate possession and I'm not going to buy it off you for another 5 years. So we would come to an agreement. All of this works on the normal sale and purchase agreement, and it all works in the further terms. If you have a look at the very front page of the sale and purchase agreement where it says price, it also then says settlement date, and it's got room for a date, and then it says underneath that, or as specified in further terms. So this is what we're talking about now. So within those further terms, you're going to negotiate how much of a deposit you're going to pay down. Sorry, just let me plug my computer back in before the juice runs out. You're going to negotiate how much of a deposit you're going to pay down. And that would come off the price, for example. You're also going to negotiate the settlement date. So that is when you actually do take title. You're going to negotiate the interest rate. And this is what differentiates the installment contract from the lease option, because you're not paying a lease, you're not renting it, you're actually paying an interest rate in order to have early access to the property, but you haven't actually settled yet. It is a form of vendor finance. A lot of even lease option is a form of vendor finance. Vendor finance is not one specific strategy, it's an overarching theme to a number of these different strategies that we're talking about. So an installment contract is you are obligated to, because on settlement date, you are legally obliged to settle that property in one way or another. Now, what would happen, let's say, for example, in 5 years' time, if, I don't know, I'm young, I'm ambitious, I've gone out and I've done 10 of these and I can't settle? Well, I would simply do a contemporaneous settlement and I would make whatever margin. Now, the only way this would backfire on me is if in the next 5 years, property prices went backwards and, you know, all of a sudden I've got a number of properties which I'm going to be having to settle because I'm obligated to settle, and I would be minus. The chances of property prices going backwards in the next 5 years, pretty slim, but this ultimately comes down to your risk tolerance anyway, right? One way you could overcome that is, one strategy I utilize is I have a what I call a shell company. So it's a company, a limited liability company, which doesn't own anything. It will never own anything. Any contract that I make is in the name of that company, and then prior to settlement, I assign it from that company or to one of my other entities. And that means that, at least from, you know, from that point of view, I am protected in a form through the limited liability status of that company. So that's an installment contract. Moving on, we've then got vendor carryback. So this is also known as deposit finance. So this is where the vendor would leave behind a certain amount of money as a second loan. So as we just heard from Hayden, for example, they will lend generally up to about 60% as asset lending. They don't care how you get the other 40%. So if I was to say to the vendor, well, I'll buy your property. So again, back to Tim. Tim's got his $500,000 property, which he paid $550 for. I might say to him, okay, well, I'll buy it from you for $550, but you're going to leave 40% behind as a second mortgage. And that way you get 60% of the lending from a mainstream or just a normal finance source. And then the other percentage would then come from the vendor leaving behind the deposit. The very first property I did was actually vendor carryback. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. It was all accidental. But basically what happened is my grandmother died. My mum and my two aunties inherited the house. They didn't really want it. My mum suggested I purchase it from them. I did everything wrong. I literally jumped on the internet, tried a few different calculators, one of the banks said, yep, we'll give you money, but we won't give you all the money you need. And so my mum then left her part of the inheritance, a portion of her inheritance, as a second mortgage or as a private loan. And the bank gave me I think we were talking like 85% mortgages back then. So they gave me 85%, my mum left the other 15%, and I was able to buy the property. So in terms of if you were to do a strategy like this, you would need to know what the finance amount is. So how much are you actually borrowing from the vendor? You'd need to know what the interest rate is. If there is an interest rate, I didn't pay my mum anything. When it was due to be repaid back. So again, if you were to do a flip, that would have a set time frame. Do they have any security? Are they putting a second mortgage on? Are they putting a caveat on the property? What security do they have to ensure that they actually get that extra, that money back? And then is there any penalty interest if you don't pay it back or you don't pay it back on time? Long settlement, early access. This is my absolute favorite one. This is where you get access to the property prior to settlement. This is in good times. In good times, this is harder to do, but in times at the moment, I know a lot of the property club guys are getting early access in order to get in and start renovating the property before they've even settled it. So what you can do is you can literally, from a mentor's point of view, this is where it gets a bit funny. We come from an education place, so I'll just put a massive disclaimer out there. Everything we say is education, and it's all possible. It's about teaching you what's possible. However, you need to be aware that with all these strategies, there's definitely risk, right? So for someone who has like barely any money, you could literally do it where you do long settlement, early access, you get in, you renovate the property, and then you sell the property on again and settle contemporaneously where you make the margin without ever having actually purchased the property. So for example, I might do a 4-month settlement. I might get early access. It might take me 1 or 2 months in order to do the renovation. I might spend like 1 month actually selling it. And then my purchaser would settle on the same day that I actually purchase, and I wouldn't have to fork out any extra money because the money would flow from my purchaser through to me. I would keep my margin, and the rest would then on flow to the actual the original vendor. That is one strategy you could do. Like I said, there's definitely risks involved if you don't have the money or you don't have the backup plan. But even if you've got the money, this is a really good way to get in and do as much work as possible before you actually purchase the property. So if you are going to do this, and this is something every mentor knows, a lot of our property club guys are doing this, you need to know how much you're paying as a deposit. Typically, you would pay a larger deposit in order to get early access, and typically you would release that early as well. You need to know what date you actually have access access to the property from, and your lawyers will negotiate this. It's called a license, so you end up with a license to occupy because you're not a tenant and you don't actually own the property yet. So you would have a license to occupy. So because of that, are you actually paying anything? Like a license fee? You wouldn't pay rent because you're not a tenant, but you might pay a license fee. And of course, if you're renovating somebody else's house, you absolutely need to make sure you have the right insurance and you've talked to your insurance broker as well, because you do not want to accidentally burn down someone else's house, which you're supposed to be settling on in a few months' time. That is not good. That is really not good. We've also then got a strategy here called rent to rent. So this is where you actually rent the entire property as a whole, and then you sublet out the different bedrooms individually. This is a strategy when I've had younger students come through, and they're trying to figure out, hey, I don't have tens of thousands of dollars. What's a strategy I can utilize? It's like, well, why don't we just start by covering the cost of your living, right? And I've still got one student, he does this today. He's got a 5-bedroom townhouse. He lives in one of the bedrooms. They rent for, let's say it's $800 per week. He rents the other 4 bedrooms out for $250 per week each, which means not only does he live for free, but he actually makes $200 per week from, again, we're talking control. What does he control this property through? He controls it through a tenancy agreement. Someone else owns it, he just controls it, and he just rents out each bedroom individually. Now, that's for someone living in there. He could do this strategy just as easily by not living in it, renting each bedroom out individually, and that same strategy, if he was to then rent his bedroom, that 5th bedroom out for $250 per week, well, now he's making $450 per week on a property that he doesn't even own, right? And so if you start thinking, if he had 2, 3, 4 of those, he could be making $450, $900, $1,350 a week. And how much money has he actually put down? He's only put down the bond, right? 4 weeks rent in advance, which as an ROI, that's pretty bloody good. So if you were to take this strategy, what would you need to know? You'd need whether you need landlord approval or not. So whether or not there's something stipulated in the tenancy agreement allowing you to sublet, you would, and whether you let the landlord know what you're doing at all. You'd also need to take into consideration whether you're going to have bonds from the individual subtenants from each of the bedrooms. What's the bond that they pay? And can you just use that to fund your own bond? And the other thing you need to take into consideration is where you purchase or where you do the strategy. Because if you have a vacant room, well, it's now you having to pay the rent on that room. This is a brilliant cash flow strategy in order to add cash flow back into your portfolio with very little money down. Obviously, a lot of these strategies take a little bit more effort than just going out and straight buying. But, you know, I've always said, if you want to know the perfect way to invest in property, walk through my door with $10 million cash. To date, no one's ever done that. And therefore, we work with you individually based upon where you're at, and show you the pathway and the strategy in order to get to where you want to be, right? Identify, inform, implement. This strategy here, rent to rent, is what I did in Bali. I rented out a 8-bedroom villa. I stayed in one of the rooms myself. I rented out all the other bedrooms. And that covered my cost of living in Bali. We had live-in staff, we had swimming pool, we had great internet, and I just built a bit of a culture around it. These are now called co-living spaces, and they're very popular. They've sort of taken over from backpackers. That's probably another strategy you could utilize. We saw a lot of backpackers coming up for sale during COVID. You could just take one on, rent it out individually, through a rent-to-rent strategy, and you would make some pretty good cash off the back of that. So then we come to a almost offshoot of the rent-to-rent strategy. Rather than renting out per room, you could rent it out on holiday accommodation. So if you were to, for example, rent a property in the CBD or in a nice sort of holiday location, you could actually then sublet that out. You would pay the weekly rent, but you would arbitrage by subletting the property out on the different platforms that are out there, Airbnb, Booking.com, Book a Cat, Batch, those types of places. And often people will pay more nightly for short-term accommodation than the average of the long-term rental. I had a couple. They replaced their income inside 11 months. So, and that was 180,000. They were making 180,000 within 11 months by doing this strategy. Everybody knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it in just like a number of different ways. So the first way you can do it is just, so you've got the rent to rent strategy, where you rent a property, you give them a fixed income, and you take the risk by putting it out on the holiday accommodation platforms, and you make the margin. The second strategy is to be a manager, and that's what they did. They started going to their friends, their family, their neighbors, all who own properties in a really good location within Auckland, like Wynyard Quarter, Beaumont Quarter, Viaduct type areas. And they actually started managing the properties on their behalf, where they were collecting 20% of everything that was booked for that night. And like I said, they then replaced their income 180,000 within 11 months. And they only owned like 2 of the 20 properties that they were actually looking after. So some of the things you need to know is, yeah, just what is that strategy? Are you managing other people's properties to put holiday makers in? Or are you actually taking the risk on yourself? Are you renting the property and then subletting it out via a rent-to-rent strategy? You need to take into consideration insurance, because what you're doing is now a commercial operation, and therefore it's a different type of insurance applied. You need to be aware of taxes. Different cities, different areas have different taxes that apply to this. Occupation rates, obviously, as opposed to a tenancy agreement where they pay you every single week. If you don't have any occupancy, then under a rent to rent strategy, you are still liable to pay the rent, but under a management fee, you're not, right? However, you're just not making money. And then of course, platform fees, all the different platforms, they charge for using them. They range at probably about 15-ish%, 15-20. So that's just something you need to take into consideration when you're running your numbers as well. Assignments. I said at the start, no, I didn't. I said it a little bit before, that when I use my holding company, my shell company, I'm able to assign the contract from that company over to another entity, another purchaser. This is called a deed of assignment. Again, it's a document that your lawyer will be very familiar with. The other thing you can do is a deed of nomination. To be honest, I have no idea what the difference is between deed of nomination and deed of assignment is. No idea, but it'll be some technical legal difference. However, an assignment, basically, you're selling your contract from your name to somebody else, who is then ultimately the person who fulfills your contract. So what you can do is you can go out and you can get a property under contract, and you can actually then sell your contract. You're not selling the property, you're selling your contract to another investor via a deed of assignment. Now, the big thing you need to be aware of here is, if you do that in New Zealand, it is deemed to be transacting real estate, and therefore you need to be a licensed real estate agent. So a lot of the buyers agencies, this is the strategy that do that. Someone touched on Hadley before instead of Hayden. This is what Hadley would typically do. I used to be a buyer's agent with iFind Property. This is what we would do. We would go out, we would get it under contract, and then we would assign it over to our purchaser, who would pay us an assignment fee, and all of that would be stipulated in our deed of assignment. Now, there are ways outside of it where we start talking the nomination, not the assignment, where I have seen people toe the line, call it a consulting fee or a project management fee or something like that. Just be aware that you are operating in a gray area. At the end of the day, someone has to complain in order for the REAA to investigate, but just be aware you're towing the line, you are operating in a gray area. But assignments, if you wanted to go through and get licensed, it is an easy way to be able to make money. But my personal favorite or preference over an assignment is a contemporaneous. So you also know it as a back-to-back. You might also know it as a double settlement. But ultimately, what it allows you to do is buy and sell on the same day. So what do we mean by buy and sell on the same day? Again, coming back to Tim's property, I want to buy it from Tim for $500,000. And let's say we put, I don't know, what's 28th of November. We put 28th of November on our as our settlement date. And then I can turn around and I can sell it to Carol for $550,000 on the 28th of November. And so what happens on the 28th of November is the lawyers make all their promises to each other. It's called undertakings. Carol's lawyer undertakes with my lawyer then undertakes with Tim's lawyer. Carol sends me $550,000. I send Tim $500,000. And I keep $50,000. One of my favorite strategies, very little risk. And as a trade, I think you can almost make as much money from doing contemporaneous as you could from doing the full renovation with far less effort. I'm quite lazy. I've never actually renovated to sell. I've only done contemporaneous because I can make very similar money without even having to renovate the property. The other thing I think, and this is where I talk about again about being the generalist rather than the specialist, is knowing that this is a strategy or that this is even possible is when you find yourself in sticky situations, or when you have committed to some longer term, like I said, lease options or installment contracts, that type of thing, and you find yourself in 5 years time not actually being able to settle, well, you can do a contemporaneous or an assignment, nomination, etc., in order to pass your contract or on sell to somebody else, which gets you out of having to actually settle the property yourself. When I did the Muriwai tiny house village, the entire thing blew up in my face. I bought it 1 month before COVID hit, lockdown, wasn't even able to get out there. Everything started going crazy. We ended up like just massive council issues. And so in the end, I didn't have 2.3 million in order to settle. I'd spent far more trying to get resource consent than I anticipated. And so what I did is I just put it back on the market. The vendors knew exactly what we're doing because I didn't go out with the whole intention of trading it. And the agent found a new purchaser, and we just lined up settlement dates, and we just settled on that day. And it passed through from my purchaser to my vendor. But I did do a very tricky, it's not sneaky, a well-informed strategy where I purchased from, how did that work? I purchased GST included and I sold GST exclusive, which saved me about $300,000. I ended up taking a loss on that deal, but it saved me from $300,000. So the key things you need to know with a contemporaneous is that when you're selling it, your selling contract matches your purchasing contract settlement dates. So like I've said, if I'm buying from Tim and selling to Carol, they need to settle on the 28th. They both need to settle on the 28th in order for it to flow through Carol, through me, and into Tim. The other key things you need to know is that your selling deposit should be higher than your purchasing deposit. So if I'm paying Tim a $50,000 deposit, then I want to be collecting at least 55, 60,000-ish from Carol, because then that means that she's paying me let's say 60. I keep 10 and I use the other 50 to pay through to Tim. The other thing you need to take into consideration is penalty interest, that your penalty interest that your purchaser is paying you. So let's say for whatever reason, your purchaser suddenly can't settle and settlement date gets pushed out 2 weeks, you're going to be charged penalty interest. So you want to make sure that I'm paying Tim, say 12%, but I'm charging Carol 14%. And in which case, I almost hope that settlement doesn't happen so that I can charge, and again, I can arbitrage that difference in penalty interest between the two. So that's contemporaneous. Again, one of my absolute favorite strategies. We've then got the guarantee. This is where you all know that you can leverage your home in order to purchase property, right? But the banks don't actually care whose property they're using, as long as they have enough security to cover their risk tolerance. So you can use someone else's property as security in order to do a deal, whether it's family, friends. I mean, you're not going to get a rando, but you can do 100% no money down deal by, for example, borrowing 60% to purchase a property and using someone else's property as security to make up for the other 40%. The bank then lends 100%, but they take the 2 properties as security. So what you need to know if you were to do that is how much equity do they have in their property. It's not going to work on someone who's highly mortgaged, but also what do they get out of it? Because obviously they're taking a lot of risk. If you screw up, well, their property is on the line and therefore they should be getting something out of it. And also, what has to happen in order to have their property released as security? So it could be, for example, let's say I've got very nice parents. They don't have a mortgage on their home. I go and buy a property. The bank takes the 2 properties as collateral. I then increase the value of my property substantially, that I've built enough equity into it that I've now got the ability to have a 60% LVR on my property, and therefore they can release my parents' property as security. Obviously, at 60% LVRs, this is difficult, but we haven't always been here. Like I said, my first property, we bought it like an 85% LVR. Back in 2012, very normal to have 95% LVRs. So this is still only temporary within the market. And as even Brendan said, there are still a number of lenders who will go higher than 80% as well. So to add enough equity to release a property as security at 80%, very easy. 60%, a little bit more difficult. Again, it's about making sure you're educated and you know what is possible. And then the final one is mezzanine finance. You also might know this as bridging finance. So a lot of lawyers have access to bridging finance, or it's even just borrowing money essentially from an angel investor, where you borrow, like again, what I asked Hayden, if I borrowed 60% from the finance company, could I borrow the other 40% from somewhere else? So that's a strategy that you could utilize in order to get 100% finance on a property. And what you need to know is what interest rates you're going to be paying, or are there any other fees involved? What are the repayment terms? What security they'd require. They're unlikely to get a first mortgage, but they might go for a second mortgage, or they might be happy to put a caveat, or they might take something else as security. another property you've got or a car you've got or something like that. And then again, if you don't pay your interest, etc., on time or repay the capital on time, what is the penalty interest that you're owed? So, as promised, 11 different strategies that you can utilize in order to control, remember that's the key word, control property with little to no money down.